Hey everyone. I had a request for a laptop performance guide for Black Desert Online. So here it is. This is not an exhaustive tweaking guide and is aimed more at people who are unfamiliar with adjusting graphics settings. As always, this is just a guideline and your mileage may vary. Before we get into the game's graphics options, there's a few points I want to go over to help temper people's performance expectations. First, don't overestimate what your computer can do. This is the number one performance issue I see on Reddit and game forums. Running a game maxed out at 1080p and 60 frames is demanding, and this is especially true with older laptops. Quite often I see posts from people who built or bought a mid-range computer several years ago and think it still solidly qualifies as a mid-range computer today. That's not really true. Compare your computer specs to the recommended requirements of a game. If you don't meet them, don't expect to max out the game at high frame rates. Second, don't judge your performance in one game and compare it to your performance in another. There are tons of factors that influence a game's performance, and just because you can max out Witcher 3 at solid frame rates does not automatically mean you can do the same in any other game. And it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with optimization. Third point, more of a general tip, plug in your laptop and put it in high performance mode. If necessary, get a cooling pad. When laptops get hot, they throttle the GPU and the CPU. Don't game on a battery. Most laptop batteries cannot support the draw rate required by gaming laptops, and even if they can't do it very long. So always game with your laptop plugged in and in high performance mode. Fourth point, Black Desert Online is an MMO, which means you are going to get frame rate drops. To an extent, frame rate and simulation speed is affected by latency. Most MMOs will slow down the clients if the server cannot update everything in an area fast enough. Just because you can get 60 frames per second in some areas does not mean you'll get them in the same area when people are around. Number 5, this one's more personal opinion, but has to do with frame rates versus frame time. Many people obsess over high frame rates, but in my opinion, a consistent time between frames is far more important. I'll go for smooth gameplay with lower overall frame rates than choppy gameplay with highs and lows any day. So it might be worth it to adjust your gameplay settings accordingly. Number 6 is actually the first thing you should do is make sure all your video card drivers are up to date, especially if you have a newer laptop. Seventh point, load times and model texture pop-in. This is very apparent in Black Desert when you're playing off a Splatter, which is a standard hard disk drive with a spinning disk. You can see in the game here the texture and mesh pop-in. On my laptop, the game is on a 7200 RPM hard drive. On my desktop, the game is on a solid state drive and that nearly eliminates texture pop-in. It also helps with overall smoothness because the game doesn't have to pause and cause a frame drop when it has to stream assets. So needless to say, loading a game off an SSD really helps. Any game that streams an SSD will reduce pop-in and overall smooth out performance. You may not get a frame rate increase, but overall it will improve the experience. Most non-gaming laptops have 5400 RPM hard drives that are very slow. If you're playing the game off one, you might want to look into replacing it with a solid state drive. Now I'm going to get into the individual settings. You can see up here in the top left corner I have MSI Afterburner running, and I'm averaging around 24 to 25 frames per second. I'm doing these demonstrations in High City because there's lots of things on screen so we can see the effects of the graphics setting. You'll notice the frame rate drop when people are around, which as I said is somewhat expected. Pretty much everything that affects your performance is on the screen tab in the options. First thing we come across is full screen windowed, and windowed. I'm not going to demonstrate each of these. From a practical standpoint, it just affects your ability to Alt-tab out into other programs. Frankly, if you're watching this guide because you're not getting good performance on your laptop, you probably don't want to multitask while you're playing. Regardless, I didn't notice any performance change, which makes sense since you're not changing the resolution or any of the graphical effects. There were reports during CB2 of Black Desert Online changing the refresh rate on the monitors and lowering them from say 144 Hz to 60 Hz or 60 Hz to 30 Hz, which will cap your frame rates if you have VSync enabled. I personally never encountered this error on either my laptop or my desktop, and I've never encountered it on either the Korean version of the game or in the beta versions, so I can't demonstrate it, but that's something to be aware of. If you think it's happening, take a look on the different forums, and some people have some solutions for that. Generally speaking, you will get better performance in full screen rather than full screen windowed or windowed, though how much depends greatly on your own setup. Personally, I did not notice a difference on either my laptop or my desktop in Black Desert Online. So again, your mileage may vary and you'll have to test the individual settings to see which works best for you. All right, resolution. The single thing that is going to affect your performance more than any other is resolution. Right now I have mine set at 1080p. That's usually what people strive for and has become the new standard. But needless to say, if you're increasing your resolution, you're going to drop your frame rates. I can demonstrate here if I drop it down to 1366 by 768, which maintains the 16 by 9 aspect ratio, and we apply that. Our frame rates jump quite a bit there. I was averaging around 25, now averaging around 45. It's smoother, and we can see in the top left corner there, it drops to around 35, but overall, it's running faster. So dropping to that level gave us about 10 frames. If we drop it again to 1280 by 720 to keep the same aspect ratio, we again get a decent performance increase. You probably noticed one huge disadvantage to lowering the display resolution is the UI scaling. Black Desert gives you options to scale the UI manually, which you can use to help alleviate this issue. But in my opinion, if you want to lower the resolution, you have a better option, which I'll go over in a moment. Texture quality. You have a few options for changing the texture quality. Depending on your video hardware, you may or may not notice a huge change in performance. If you have an older laptop with a lower amount of video RAM, slower video RAM, a slow memory bus, or if you're using integrated graphics, you'll likely notice a larger performance increase when lowering the texture quality. At lower texture quality, you may also notice less texture pop-in and less stuttering due to streaming. I personally didn't notice the texture quality hit that bad when I lowered the texture quality. You gain a few frames from it. It doesn't really harm the aesthetics of the game too much, and the trade-off between frame rate and quality is pretty much on par there. You gain a few frames, you lose a bit of quality, so you'll have to play with that yourself and see if you can find a setting there that you like. Anti-aliasing. Anti-aliasing is for removing jaggies. I'm not 100% sure what type of anti-aliasing method Black Desert is using. I think it's a form of FXAA, which is fast approximate anti-aliasing, and that's just based on what I see happening when I enable or disable it. So I'll go over to these vines here so you can see the effects. You can see the effect right away when I disable AA. They go a little more crisp, but you can definitely see the aliasing in the lines. And if you apply it, it blurs everything. And that's what makes me think it's FXAA, because it's a typical trait of FXAA. The good thing about FXAA is that it is fast. That's why it's called fast approximate anti-aliasing. I don't think you're likely to see a huge performance increase without it. When I shut it off, I got maybe 1 or 2 frames per second. When I was testing on my desktop, there was zero noticeable performance increase. The quality hit isn't terrible. I personally really dislike aliasing, so I generally have AA cranked up in all my games. But again, if you're running a weaker system, you'll want to see what kind of performance benefit it gives you. If you find you get a few frames from it, I don't think the visual hit is that bad, so it might be worth leaving it off for you. Unfortunately, there's no way to adjust the anti-aliasing levels independently. They're controlled by the overall graphics quality, which I'll go into last. Next is depth of field. You will only notice this in cutscenes and when you disable the UI. I'm just going to kick off the menu here and disable the UI so you can see it. That blurring effect is depth of field. So we can see with it on, we're sitting in the low 20s. Let's turn the UI back on and disable it. Disable the UI again. We gain a few frames on this system. Call it 4 or 5 on average. It's hardly a scientific test, but since you only notice it when you disable the UI or in cutscenes, or when you're idle, it's up to you whether or not you want to leave it on. Like I said, it's good for about 5 frames on my system when it's deactive. Show blood. That's blood splatter effect on things. It may slow things down in combat a bit, but I actually didn't do any testing with it. It's easy enough to test out yourself if you think it's slowing you down. SSAO. This is screen space ambient occlusion. At a high level, SSAO fakes depth on a two-dimensional surface by applying shadow maps to textures. In Black Desert Online, I find SSAO is very noticeable when you disable it. Let me go over to a wall here. We'll go Settings and disable SSAO, and you can really see the difference. Interestingly enough, you actually notice it more when you lower the graphics quality. Since you're relying more on SSAO instead of actual lighting effects to give you depth, when you drop the SSAO at lower quality, you really take a visual quality hit. It's good for a few frames. I gain 2 to 3 frames with it disabled, but frankly, I don't think the graphics hit is worth it. SSAO is done really well in Black Desert, and it's very noticeable when it's gone. I'd rather lower my resolution a notch than get rid of SSAO. If you find on your system SSAO is giving you a huge performance hit, you can of course get rid of it or shut it off. But again, I don't think the performance increase is going to be worth getting rid of it. Improved distance. Basically, it makes your very distant terrain look better. Depending on where I am, I do get a frame rate hit with it enabled on this system, anywhere from 2 to 5 frames. I generally leave it off. I think I even have it off on my desktop. I really don't notice that much. Actually, I really don't notice at all. If you spend a lot of time looking at the landscapes, you might want to turn it on. I personally don't think the visual quality hit outweighs even the few frames you get from leaving it off. And I'm not going to say any more on that. Try it out and see what works best on your system. Show blood on display. That's drawing blood effects on your own display. I didn't test it, but my guess it's done with a screen overlay, so you probably won't see any impact by enabling or disabling it. You can test it out if you want, but again, I don't think you're going to see any performance impact with it on or off. Screen filter is kind of a cool effect. It looks similar to a depth of field effect that blurs out objects in the distance. If you look in the distance at the farmhouse, you'll notice it's a little blurred out. Now, if we go into settings and disable the screen filter, you'll notice the house is now nice and crisp. The performance hit depends on how much distant terrain you're looking at. In testing, I noticed it was 3 to 4 frames when looking at a lot of terrain. In towns, I didn't notice any frame rate hit at all. I personally leave it on. I rather like the effect. I think it really adds to the aesthetics of the game. If you don't like it, turn it off and see if you get a few more frames. Next on our list is high-end mode. This is easily the single best way to tank your frame rates. So I'm going to go ahead and enable it. And you can see just how much it kills the frame rate on my laptop here. Sweet. Now we're blazing fast. So it's hard to say exactly what high-end mode is doing. Even a side-by-side screenshot comparison, it's hard to pick out all the individual things that are being changed. The most obvious things, it seems to improve both the lighting and the shadows. Texture pop also isn't as bad with it on, and likely that's because it's streaming more assets into video memory, which is of course going to slow your game down. As you can see though, I've taken a huge performance hit. To give you an idea of the performance hit, my desktop has a GHz edition GTX 780. That card benchmarks just under a 780 Ti, and high-end mode cuts my frame rates clearly in half on my desktop system. So unless you've got a really beefy system, and really not likely a laptop, shut that off and leave it off. Unless, of course, you're doing screenshots. It makes for really nice, pretty screenshots. I'm going to go through these next couple fairly quickly. Remove others' lanterns. Have you ever seen that annoying yellow glow everywhere when you're walking around, usually when other players are around? That's probably what's causing it. Turn it off if for no other reason than it looks ugly as sin. Remove distant player effects and remove others effects. They do exactly what they say. One removes the combat effects from distant players and the other removes the effects from all players except for you. If you're in an area with lots of players around in combat, You may want to disable these if your frame rate drops. Energy saver. If you're AFK and your screensaver kicks in, this reduces the game's power usage. If you were planning on AFKing on a laptop, I'd actually make some other adjustments in the system's power management, but that's for another video. You can leave this alone for now. Changing it in-game will have absolutely no effect while you're actively playing whatsoever. Next on our list is crop mode. Crop mode basically renders a border around your screen to reduce your screen size. So I'll go ahead and enable it, and it renders the game in a nice little window. You can change the size of the window via the sliders in the options menu. You can see in the top left corner there via Afterburner, it does improve my frame rates. I find playing like this annoying. It's up to you if you want to do it, of course. If you want to keep your resolution higher and quality higher and don't mind playing the game through a postage stamp, hey, all the power to you. Those of you who are playing on, say, a 17-inch laptop or a laptop with a 17-inch screen, you might actually find it to your liking because you've got a little more screen real estate there. But if you're playing on a smaller laptop screen, I think the reduced screen space just will not be worth it. Upscaling. What this does is renders the game at a resolution below the display resolution, then upscales the game for display. Basically, this is what console systems do to show games at 1080p. So let me enable that, and you'll see a definite change in the quality here. This is functionally similar to lowering your resolution. The beauty of upscaling, and you probably noticed, is that it does not change the resolution of the UI. The UI is rendered at your display resolution. So if you're thinking of playing the game on a lower resolution, upscaling may be worth looking at. One thing I will point out here is I'm playing the game on a 15.4-inch screen displaying at 1920 by 1080, and upscaling does not look too bad. Obviously, you're rendering it at a lower resolution, so you lose some distant features and get more aliasing. But at 15 inches, it's certainly not unplayable, and the game still looks pretty good overall. Just for fun, I tried it on my desktop on the 27-inch display, and it looked terrible. Reminded me of early 3D games from the late 90s. So if you're playing it on your laptop screen and not going above 15 inches, I recommend you try upscaling. Remember too, I currently have this set on high, and I'm averaging in the low to mid 30s walking around Hydel. That's not too bad. If I lowered some of the other settings, I could probably get that higher without too much trouble. Another thing I'll point out is that it's very smooth. It's hard to see on a YouTube video, especially since I'm only recording at 30 frames per second, but it's very smooth. There's very little input lag, and overall it feels like my frame times are more normalized than they are at a higher resolution where they're spiking all over the place. So it's more than playable upscaling. Definitely worth looking at if you're having performance issues. Photo filters. These are post-processing effects applied after the frame is rendered. Very similar to Sweet FX and Reshade and things like that. Chances are you're not going to see any frame rate difference with them enabled or by switching between the different ones. So pick whichever one you like and you can play with it. You're not likely to see any performance hit. I'm going to go back to the one I skipped over before, which is overall graphics quality. I've been doing all these demonstrations with mine set on very high, but I found for each level you lower this, you gain 3 to 5 frames on average. So between very high and low, you should see about a 15 frame per second impact. Again, that's an estimation based on my own system, and your actual performance change may be different. Lowering this setting below medium really starts to hurt the visual quality of the game in my opinion. I'll show you what it looks like on the lowest mode here. As you can see, it looks pretty terrible. But if it's the only way you can get a good frame rate to play the game, you may not have much choice. I'd personally recommend you set it on medium or high to start, and then enable or disable the other effects I've talked about to see if you can find a compromise you like. That concludes my high-level Black Desert Online performance tweaking overview. If you have any ideas for videos you'd like to see, please let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.